Hello, everybody, and welcome to the launch of our report, The Impact of Voter ID, the Views of Administrators, by us here at the Local Government Information Unit. My name is Dr. Greg Stride, and I'm a researcher at the Local Democracy Research Centre. First, I'd like to thank our funders at the JRSST Charitable Trust. I'd also like to extend a massive thank you to the Association of Electoral Administrators who have helped us throughout this research, and also to all the administrators who joined in with every stage of the research. I'm now going to take a bold step, and I'm going to start with our conclusion. I want to keep these core points in mind as we go ahead. So if you feel like stopping watching, wait for the first couple of minutes and then you could stop. So elections are an essential local service and part of the critical infrastructure of UK democracy, and they should be treated that way. That's the first big conclusion we have, is that elections are not just something that we should think of as being an ordinary service that you know, it can happen or it can't happen. They're an essential local service. Secondly, the electoral services sector has been under serious strain for years, and the introduction of voter ID and the other changes introduced by the Elections Act are adding to that pressure below the surface. So electoral identification isn't really introducing a series of new pressures. What it's doing is exacerbating existing pressures, and this is something we need to be very clear about. Voter ID hasn't come in to an electoral sector that's perfect. It's come into an electoral sector that's already struggling. And we'll get through why that is as we go through the rest of the research. There are reasons to think that some of the problems mentioned here, such as staff shortages, difficult timetables, or processing new applications, may be much more of an issue in the case of a general election. So we're talking to you now after the May 2023 local elections, which happened across some parts of England. At a general election, there are likely to be many, many more people who are interested, and subsequently many, many more people voting, registering, applying for elections, applying for electoral identification, I should say, and applying for postal votes. All these things that are difficult for staff to stay on top of. Secondly, I have to say that we haven't seen the full scale of the impact of voter ID, and we won't for a long time. We won't until at least the next general election. That's when I think we'll start to see what voter ID, the impact of voter ID is happening. And there's lots of different reasons for that, but primarily it's because people don't vote at general elections. Sorry, people don't vote at local elections anyway. The turnout for local elections is quite low, and we'll see more of the impact when we get to a general election where turnout tends to be much higher. There are reasons to be seriously concerned about elections in the UK, and it's not possible, in our view, to be too prepared for future elections or too concerned about election failure. As I said earlier, elections are part of the critical infrastructure of the UK democracy and should be treated that way. And if you think that I'm exaggerating, it's hard not to be worried about this when I would hear things like the quote from one administrator where I said, have you ever felt like you wouldn't be able to deliver a successful election or like there was a threat to delivering a successful election? And they responded, I would probably say every election for the last 10 years, and I'm not joking. That's the kind of thing that's difficult to ignore. A final conclusion that I sort of rushed past is that we already know about several significant threats to elections, primarily the capacity of electoral administrators to deliver elections. What we don't know about are the future threats. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of things like cybersecurity. We all saw about the Electoral Commission hack that happened a few weeks ago. We don't know how much of a problem that's going to continue to be and how much of an issue that will add on top of the things that we already know about. And we need to be resilient and prepared for those things. Just to go through the context, I think lots of people will know this already, but in May 2023, there were local elections across 230 councils in England, as well as a few parish councils, which we're not entirely sure how many. Voters are now asked to show an acceptable form of photographic ID before casting their vote in a polling station. This is the first time this has ever happened in England, outside of a few pilot studies. And the list of acceptable identification was published quite late in the day. I think it was around January or February of 2023. And the list of acceptable identification is quite long and quite complicated. And that's something that we'll come back to as we go through this report. This means that most electoral administrators across England now have experience with the process, but none in Wales, Scotland, or London, with the exception of a few who have had some by-elections by this point. Our research was to ask these small teams how the implementation of voter ID went. So when I say these small teams, I mean the small teams of electoral administrators. These are the permanent election staff who are embedded within councils whose job it is to make sure elections happen. They deal with registration, they deal with postal vote applications, they deal with organising the polling day, they deal with organising the count, they do everything that needs to happen for an election to happen, including training the on-the-day staff like poll clerks and presiding officers. Just to briefly go through what the research was, we did a survey of 171 electoral administrators, which was diverse across roles, regions, and urbanicity, which means that we asked people from across England, the places having elections. We also asked people of various levels of seniority, and we asked people in cities and rural areas. We did interviews with 11 electoral administrators across the regions, and we did this primarily to inform the research that we'd already found from the survey. Our research is intentionally behind the scenes. So many other researchers are looking at the impact on the public. For example, we wanted to know what the impact looked like for the people whose job it is to actually make voter ID happen. And from that, we've managed to gather insights that would have been very difficult to see from elsewhere. So I'm going to quickly move on to the results. And we're going to start with the results to do with administration, which is one of the areas where we saw the biggest problems. So I asked electoral administrators what they saw as the greatest problems with elections. And overall, I think we can see all of the ones here that are in purple tend to be the biggest ones, and these are administrative issues. So you can see that 96% of administrators, oh no, 94% I think of administrators said that the challenge of organising snap elections was a problem for elections in England. And this is the kind of thing that we wouldn't really be able to see without asking electoral administrators. But organising snap general elections, when a snap general election is called, electoral administrators have a very small amount of time to make sure everything can get done. And that's only going to become more difficult with the new things that they have to do because of voter ID. Second, we have 88% of administrators saying that recruiting polling station staff is an issue, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We also have over 80% saying that insufficient funding of electoral services departments is an issue. Complex electoral law is considered to be an issue by about 78%. And then finding and booking adequate polling stations by 68 or 67%. And then the statutory timetable for delivering elections, which really feeds into the challenge of organising snap elections as well, and unequal electoral services provision. All of these are considered to be major problems with elections by the majority of electoral administrators we spoke to. All of these are over 50% of administrators said this was a problem. Just to briefly talk about something that wasn't on that graph though, I'd like to speak about the impact, or the personal impact on electoral administrators. So as you can see here, we have this graph which is about working in elections, and over 95% of administrators said that working on elections is stressful, and an even greater percentage said that election staff are overworked during elections. This is, to be frank, an inhumane level of stress and overwork. Coupled with this, 88% said that the elections in May were more difficult to organise than other elections that they worked on, and 77% that they were more stressful. So not only are things already difficult, they're getting more difficult. And over 75% of administrators said that working in electoral administration is more difficult now than it used to be. So things are challenged, and they're becoming more challenging. And as I said before, this is a problem for several reasons. The first one is that it's simply inhumane. And I'm going to come back to a quote from an electoral administrator exploring the sort of inhumaneness of this. I would say from 2012, it's just been year after year. And every year we kind of say it can't be as bad as next year. It can't be. And every year it seems to get even worse and even more challenging. I would say it's exhausting now. On a very serious note, a few colleagues have actually gone off quite seriously sick this time from stress, and it is a real concern. This is something that we need to be listening to. Nobody should be put through this position. Nobody should be put through this situation in their work at all. But equally, nobody who's working on critical infrastructure should be put in this situation. Nothing as crucial as elections should be reliant on people working this hard and going through this type of terrible stress. Secondly, electoral administration, the impact on electoral administrators is a problem because it reflects very poorly on the resilience of elections. So if people in the core elections teams decided to work only their contracted hours and not put in any overtime or any time in lieu or anything like that, the election won't get delivered, is what it boils down to. This is from another administrator. The real issue with this is that it indicates that electoral administrators are going above and beyond systematically in order to make elections run. And if they didn't do this, then the election simply wouldn't happen. And that's a very difficult situation to face up to, and something that we need to consider. On the specific question of staffing polling stations, we've seen that lots of electoral administrators believe that there is a new pressures on electoral administrators because of this. So one of the greatest challenges they talked about was the recruitment and retention of staff to working polling stations. 88% of electoral administration staff who answered the survey said the recruiting polling station staff was a problem, and 83%, so these two bars here on the far right, said that it would be made more difficult by voter identification. In our interviews, administrators mentioned that recruiting polling station staff had become more difficult during the pandemic and that the introduction of voter ID had increased this difficulty. Experienced members of staff are deciding to stop working on elections because of the increased complexity of their role. As one senior electoral administrator from a district council put it, we have more dropouts of experienced staff than we have ever had. There were people who had done it for many years, though, and that said outright at the beginning, we're not interested in the extra responsibility of this. And it sort of goes without saying that staffing polling stations is essential to make an election happen. And if nearly 90% of administrators are saying this is an issue and over 80% are saying it's becoming more of an issue because of voter ID, this is something we need to be aware of, and we need to put things in place to make sure that it doesn't continue to be a problem. Something else that came up very frequently is the complexity of electoral law, which is widely regarded by administrators as causing significant problems for elections. In our survey, 78% of administrators considered it a problem. A 2020 Law Commission report described electoral legislation as complex, voluminous, and fragmented. In 2021, the Association of Electoral Administrators went so far as to say that elections are often delivered in spite of, rather than because of, the fragmented and outdated legislative framework. There were a few elements this year that made electoral law even more complex with the changes of the Elections Act in 2022, and I'm thinking particularly of the new things that electoral administrators have to do with voter authority certificates and temporary voter authority certificates, and also just with the list of accepted identification. Poll clerks and presiding officers have to understand, and the public has to understand. And with something this convoluted, that's very, very difficult. And it's only going to get more complicated. This is not the end of the changes introduced by the Elections Act. And we're looking at things like online absent vote applications, and particularly the way that these laws are going to be differently applied in Scotland, Wales, and the rest of the UK. So in Wales, for example, you will have to show voter identification to vote in a general election and a police and crime commissioner election, but not in a local election. So this is going to be something that's quite difficult to get your head around. The other problem with electoral law is that it came in very late. The secondary legislation was put down very late on, and this included the things like the list of acceptable, or the guidance on acceptable forms of identification. So as one administrator said, we were doing some jobs so late down the line because we were just waiting for the right guidance, waiting for resources to come through. You know, a lot of the things that we would have done, we could have done 2 months before if we'd had that, referring to the guidance. This is against the Gould principle, which is the idea that no changes to electoral law should come in 6 months or more, or 6 months, within 6 months of an election. And we've seen this happen over and over and over again, that election law is being brought in too late for electoral administrators to be able to work around it. Finding and booking polling stations. So from the survey, this looks like a relatively good result. Over 75% of administrators said that finding and booking polling stations was about as difficult as it had been before. But unfortunately, 68% of administrators said they viewed finding and booking adequate polling stations as a problem. According to our evidence, the scale of this problem wasn't significantly increased by the introduction of voter ID, but this may be because it was already prohibitively difficult. We've heard stories about the closure of community halls, limited free public spaces, and schools resistant to closure in a context where there's ongoing strike action, and also where there's concerns with vulnerable students. This is all contributing to making polling stations harder to source. As one administrator put it, think about how many polling stations are things like churches, community halls, village halls, scout group buildings, scout huts, and these are venues that are slowly disappearing. We probably lose a polling station or two every year that we then have to look around to replace, either going to a school, which is always a contentious decision, or placing a mobile polling station, which is suboptimal, and that makes it challenging each year. And unfortunately, I have to say that this is one of those things that may be worse during a general election. This is already an issue during the local elections, but it may continue to be exacerbated. Finally, I want to talk about the last point on administration, how supported different electoral administrators felt by different organizations. So the Association of Electoral Administrators was considered to be supported by over 98% of election staff. And I want to highlight how incredible this is and the great work the Association of Electoral Administrators is doing to support electoral administrators across the country. Then there was the Electoral Commission, and particularly we heard that the guidance they produce is often very good. The wider local authority outside the electoral services team, this is sort of dependent on the relationship that the different local authorities and have with their electoral administration teams. We go through this in a bit more detail in the report, but essentially it's crucial that electoral administrators work with their wider local authority and have the support of their wider local authority. And then finally, at the bottom here, you have the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, where under 50% felt supported. This ideally would be improved. And one of the suggestions that electoral administrators had is that they could have a single point of contact in the Department for Levelling Up, whose job it is to give them guidance as and when they need it. Just to conclude on administration, Voter ID has been introduced to an electoral sector already under serious strain. It's become harder to find and train polling station staff, deliver everything in time and understand the legislation, and it may continue to get more difficult in the case of a general election where everything is turned up to 11, and with more changes coming with the Elections Act. As a consequence, staff, and by that I mean electoral administrators, are under immense pressure, and many administrators pointed out the extraordinary lengths they and their teams systematically go to in order to make elections happen. Lots of food for thought. I'm going to move on to security. So this is one of the primary reasons that voter ID was introduced, was to increase the security of the process. I asked electoral administrators about their opinions on security, and many of them, these are the ones highlighted in purple, are the primarily security-related concerns. We see that the greatest security concern, with around 15% of administrators saying that they saw it as a problem, is the intimidation of voters. And then the smallest one is personation in the polling station, which is the one that voter ID should change. It's the one that voter ID is introduced in order to change. Now, this is very, very low, the personation, the proportion of electoral administrators who are worried about personation. I have to say that from previous research, it was already very low. So it's good that it's very low, because otherwise we might have an issue with personation, but it was already low before the introduction of voter ID. What I want to emphasize here is that of all these security concerns, these are considered to be minor problems in comparison to the major administrative issues that are facing electoral administrators across the country at the moment. There is also something that wasn't mentioned in any of these problems, and if we're going to continue to do this research, I think we should start mentioning it, which is the proportion of electoral administrators who heard about disturbances in polling stations. And this is undoubtedly a security issue. As one administrator said to us, parliamentary elections mean an awful lot more to people than local elections, unfortunately. So I think if someone had been turned away, and because of that, they didn't have ID with them for a parliamentary election, I think they'd be a lot more angry about it than, the people just go, oh, well, it's just a local. And I think this is one of those things that we need to keep an eye on. So we didn't see widespread disturbances at polling stations. We asked electoral administrators, and I think something like 17%, it's in the report, said that they heard about disturbances, but there weren't widespread disturbances, although that's already too high, of course. This is not guaranteed to continue, and it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And definitely the things that are put in place in order to keep polling station staff safe, like police protection and this sort of thing, that still needs to be considered. Voter ID is not over, and the impact is not, we have not fully seen it yet. On to inclusivity, which is how much people, members of the public, have an opportunity to participate and how much they choose to participate in elections. So electoral administrators, there are two problems with inclusivity that were seen as an issue. The first one is low voter turnout, which is seen as an issue by more than 80% of administrators, and this has historically been the same. Electoral administrators have been particularly concerned with voter turnout at local elections and police and crime commissioner elections. And then there's barriers to participation for minority groups, which was a more mixed picture, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Turnout, to start with turnout. So we know that electoral administrators in general are concerned about turnout, but we also know that this isn't new. It's very difficult to determine the effect of voter ID on aggregate turnout. So the Electoral Commission published this very morning on the 13th of September, 2023, that turnout in 2019 was 32.5%, and in 2023 it's 32%. But we can't say at all that this was due to voter ID, because there's so many different factors that affect whether people come out to vote. On the other hand, they did also report that around 14,000 people were turned away at these elections, which is a large number of people. And they also said that this is almost definitely an underestimate of the total number of people who were put off from voting, because this is only the people who made it to the polling station desk and were then told that they had to leave because they didn't have the right kind of ID. There will be many, many more people who didn't get through the door in the first place because they were turned away, or people who decided just to stay at home because they knew they didn't have ID. The Electoral Commission also said that around 4% of all non-voters said they didn't vote because of the ID requirement. Either they objected to the ID requirement or they didn't have ID. And this translates to thousands of people in the event of a general election. Thousands of people who could previously exercise their democratic rights who will be unable to because of voter ID. But as electoral administrators were keen to point out to us, turnout is always more of a function of the type of election than anything to do with election rules or electoral administration. What really makes people turn out or not turn out is whether it's a general election or a police and crime commissioner election or any other kind of election. Now, on the other issue, which is the equality, so whether different groups were differently affected by voter ID, electoral administrators emphasized to us that they weren't in a great position to comment on this, and there were very mixed opinions on it. So you can see here that many administrators said that compared to other elections, the May elections were roughly as inclusive as other elections. And when we asked specifically about Whether any groups found it harder than average to vote because of the ID requirements, 42% said yes, and 58% said no. I'm going to briefly go through what we think this means. So there were very mixed opinions from administrators. There were groups mentioned by the administrators who thought that there had been significant differences between groups, and those were elderly electors, younger electors, disabled electors, electors without English as a first language, LGBTQ plus electors, electors who wear face coverings for religious reasons, poor electors, and electors without access to the internet. But electoral administrators were also keen to point out that they had concerns over whether they would even know. The amount of data that they had was quite limited on this, and I'll go to a quote on that in just a second. I also want to say that electoral administrators were keen to say that extending the list of acceptable ID was seen as core to avoiding these issues, as was communicating election rules clearly to members of the public with a well-funded national communications campaign. Just on whether electoral administrators would even know about differences in different social groups, we had a few administrators say to us, "Oh, we get numbers of people turned away from polling stations, but we don't get a male aged 45, so on, workers or whatever." So I think no, we don't really notice anything in particular, to be honest. And then another administrator said, "We have no way of knowing how many simply chose not to go and vote without contacting us." And this is kind of the predicament that electoral administrators find themselves in when judging this sort of thing, is that they only hear from people who get in touch with them. And it was also pointed out that the kinds of people who vote in a local election, like we had in May, tend to be a little bit different from the types of people who vote in a general election because they're unusually attached to the voting process. On communicating election rules, on the other hand, there was near unanimity that voter ID made communicating election rules more difficult. So just to focus on that for a second, 85% of administrators in our survey said that the voter ID requirements had increased the difficulty of communicating election rules to the public. And throughout our interviews, electoral administrators spoke about the additional efforts they had to put in on a local level, often very imaginative, to ensure that as many electors as possible were aware of this change. The element of the legislation most frequently mentioned as causing a problem for electors was the list of acceptable identification, where electors expected to be able to use various unsanctioned forms of ID, such as NHS cards and firearms licenses. This is an example put together by the Electoral Reform Society on why communicating election rules might be difficult. So an Oyster 60+ card counts as identification, and an Oyster 18+ card doesn't, which is the sort of thing that is really hard to get across to members of the public. On inclusivity then, just to conclude, there are concerns about turnout, but these have been around from long before voter ID. There are mixed opinions on the equality of the process, hampered by data collection issues. There's near unanimity that voter ID has made communicating election rules more difficult, and concern that the scale of this challenge will increase at a general election. Finally, I want to come on to public perceptions, which is all about how the public thinks about elections rather than anything they might do. So first of all, I just want to say that electoral administrators in general believe that the public should be confident in elections and that they should be interested in and informed about elections. Really interesting results from the survey. So about 60% of administrators said that members of the public are confident that elections in the UK are free and fair, which is lower than you would ideally want it to be. You want it to be very, very high indeed, because it's part of the foundation of democracy that people believe in election results. So we need to do more research on why this might be, and the Electoral Commission produces useful and interesting reports on this sort of thing, and also whether this might have been affected by voter ID. On the other hand, down here, I asked about whether the introduction of mandatory voter ID in polling stations has reduced public concerns about fraud, and only about 14% of electoral administrators argued that it had, or agreed that it had, sorry. So one of the reasons that the government said they were introducing voter ID was to reduce public concerns about fraud, and what we've seen here is that electoral administrators are skeptical that this has actually happened. On the other hand, there is some good news, which is that only around 15% of administrators thought that members of the public believe there are high levels of electoral fraud. So really the amount of confidence that members of the public have in there not being electoral fraud is relatively high, it seems. Unfortunately, again, only around 18% of administrators said that members of the public are interested in elections. So this is one of the key difficulties that we've got here. We have the puzzle of public perceptions included to do with voter ID. So public opinion could shift in very different ways because of voter ID. It could decrease concerns about fraud, although we've seen that electoral administrators are skeptical about how successful this has been. It could also increase complaints about the impartiality of election rules. Administrators told us that they quite frequently heard complaints about, well, this is being brought in to stop people like me from voting. And that's the sort of thing that we really, really need to look out for, because election rules should be beyond reproach. And we only have to look to the United States to see what can happen if people start to not believe in the results of elections. In general, the greatest concerns that administrators had were about the level of public interest and understanding, not only related to voter ID, but to elections in general. And there was a problem again of it being a local election. So as one administrator said to us, we had so little engagement that it is really quite hard to say how people felt. And the unfortunate thing is that we might have to wait until the general election to see how people are going to react to voter ID. And by that point, it may be too late and public confidence could be severely eroded if things are going to go in that direction. Public perceptions are important, I should say. One of the greatest risks elections have is that members of the public stop trusting the results, as I said, and more research is necessary to monitor perceptions of the process. Just to finally conclude, those were the 4 chapters in our report. For more information, the full report is now available, and wherever you're watching this, it should be linked nearby. We haven't spent long here today on what could be done to change any of these issues, but we do have lots of suggestions. And at the end of every chapter, we outline the main problems in each of the respective chapters, and also the solutions that we think we can take on in order to mitigate these issues. We're also very welcome to feedback, comments, and questions, and you can always get hold of me at greg.stride@lgiu.org. Thank you very much again for watching, and I've been Dr. Greg Stride at the LGIU. Thanks.